Hello and welcome. This is Social Studies, Voices Across America. I'm Bill Wood.
And I'm Peter Goldsmith.
Peter, this is an interesting story we're going to be talking about today. It's the second part of our election talk coverage, and it talks about the Electoral College and voting rights that are changing here in the United States.
Yeah, Bill, you know, I've always heard the Electoral College, get rid of it. It's full of malarkey. It's terrible. We don't need it. And that may be true, but today we're going to get into it a little bit more. And as you did, I did a bunch of research on this stuff, and it's quite interesting. It really is. You know, and we'll talk more about it. I know you've got a great video that we're going to take a look at too. So let's look at the video and then let's start. And then when we finish up a little bit with the Electoral College, we'll jump over to not only voter rights, but voter restrictions and things like the black codes that most people don't know about. But let's start at the beginning with the Electoral College.
Some critics of the Electoral College argue the system gives an unfair advantage to states with large numbers of electoral votes. Think of it this way. It is possible for a candidate to not get a single person's vote, not one vote, in 39 states or the District of Columbia, yet be elected president by winning the popular vote in just 11 of these 12 states: California, New York, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Georgia, or Virginia. This is why both parties pay attention to these states. However, others argue that the Electoral College protects small states such as Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and even geographically large states with small populations, like Alaska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. That's because a candidate can't completely ignore small states, because in a close election, every electoral vote counts. There are certain states that have a long history of voting for a particular party. These are known as safe states. For the past 4 election cycles, in 1996, 2000, 2004, and 2008, Democrats could count on states like Oregon, Maryland, Michigan, and Massachusetts, whereas the Republicans could count on states like Mississippi, Alabama, Kansas, and Idaho. States that are teetering between parties are called swing states. In the past 4 election cycles, Ohio and Florida have been swing states, twice providing electoral votes for a Democratic candidate and twice providing electoral votes for a Republican.
That was from one of the great TED Talks that you could get lost in those things, and it's part of a longer piece about the Electoral College. But Peter, I also was wondering, what do we need this for? But when you look at it, it's only been 5 times in history. We had 45 presidents, and only 5 have been elected with a minority of the popular vote winning in the Electoral College. That's not much.
No, it's not too much, Bill. Let's go back again in history. The Electoral College was really established in 1804. And the idea of the Electoral College was to prevent a tyrant from manipulating the election. Well, here we are in 2018, and we do have a tyrant manipulating the election, and his name is Russia. And he manipulated 216. And
hopefully him, people.
Yeah, and hopefully he won't influence 2018. But the idea was interesting to me because, you know, everyone says we have a democracy, and we don't. We have a republic. That's our form of government, a republic. And the two are different here. So we elect electors to elect the president. That's really what we do. So when you're casting a vote for candidate A or candidate B, what you're really saying is the electors who represent us, we want you, elector, to vote for this candidate. And that's what the elector supposedly does.
And so, yeah, there are 538 people in the Electoral College. All of our elected representatives in the House and the Senate, and 3 electors from the District of Columbia. So when you go to the polls, we think we're voting for a president, whomever, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, whomever, but we're actually voting on the electors who will go to Washington in December and decide who the state, I think all but 2 states, it's a complete winner take all, but there are 1 or 2 states that a proportion, if you get 10% of the votes in that state, then 10% of the electors will vote for that.
Right.
In reality, this was a compromise by the founding fathers. In their brilliance, they did see that it was going to be possible for a tyrant maybe to come in. Now, the other side of that tyrant rule is there was some fear that people who didn't have power in 1780, non-property owners, indentured servants, and slaves, they were afraid that maybe they might step up and overrule the ruling class. They didn't want to call it a ruling class then, but they were afraid that that might happen. And so what they decided to do was to put these safeguards in to keep tyrants from taking over. Now, let me throw an odd question to you, Peter. We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but it just popped into my head. You think the Electoral College is necessary now? Do you think we have to worry about tyrants? Do we have to worry about the non-elite? We don't have indentured servants anymore, but we do have people who, felons, who can't vote anymore, and that's changing in several states. But do you think the Electoral College is still needed?
I don't, Bill. I actually don't. I think we have a system now that's more regulated, and I think we're more able to cast a direct vote. The word that is used a lot in the literature is to create a buffer between. I don't think at this point we need a buffer between. There was a great hue and cry in the last election in 2016 about who won the popular vote and who won the electoral vote. And I think those things just cause more reason for belief in some kind of conspiracy here and there. I don't think that's necessary. I think we've updated our machinery, again, if Russia doesn't get in the middle of it. I think we've updated our machinery, i.e. our computers, well enough to take a popular vote and continually to address it only. The Electoral College is an interesting idea, but I think it's gone the way of the, I don't know, what's that bird that's no longer around, something bird.
Yeah.
I don't think we need it, no. I'm not as against it as I was before I did the research and read it, but I really still do not believe we need it, no.
So does that mean then that if we got rid of the Electoral College, would we run the risk of candidates only campaigning, like we saw in the video, in maybe 10 or 11 states where they have the largest populations in California, New York, Texas, Illinois, Massachusetts, the big cities?
You know, Bill, maybe, but I think that's the story right now. If you look at presidential candidates who go on the campaign trail, they spend most of their time in those states because they have the most people. So whether they're Electoral College representatives or electors, or whether you're talking about a straight popular vote, you know, that's a reality. You know, there's more people in California and in New York to combine than there are in 18 other states. So of course the popular vote and the electoral vote is going to come from those 2 large states. Some of the other 11, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, I forget, North Carolina is one of them, I forget the other ones. But that's where the population lives. There is no population in Wyoming and in Idaho, so to speak, which is why they're such wonderful states to live in. North Dakota, South Dakota. So no, I don't think that that's the case, Bill. I don't. And I think it's a philosophical question that you're asking, because we went into this on our first podcast. But again, let's reiterate the philosophy of voting. You know, my vote doesn't matter. I'm one single person living in wherever you may be living, Little Rock, Arkansas, or, you know, Boise, Idaho. If you feel that way, then it doesn't matter. You know, you're not the person who's going to tabulate votes. You're the person who's voting your conscience. You're the person who's voting for the person you want to lead him, her, for the next 4 years. Whether it's done electorally or whether it's done in a popular way, I still think you're making the same philosophical statement. I want candidate B to be my president. And of course, vice president goes with that. We don't split that vote, as many countries do, by the way. We don't. So I think that's the reality of the situation, and you can call it anything you want. And I think the Electoral College, really, to my way of thinking, is superfluous in 2018.
I don't know. I hate to be on the fence, but I am sort of on the fence with this. I basically agree with you, but I do think that if I lived in, I'd put it this way, in California, I've lived here most of my life. In California, we used to have our primary used to be in June, and there was a big hue and cry in June that the president, the candidates were essentially chosen by the time our primary came around. We had no impact. They moved it to March one year. I think it was on Super Tuesday, and we had an impact. It's gone back and forth since then, and I think it's better if the state with the most people has a voice in who's going to be president.
Yeah.
Now, we found out in the last election in 2016 where only 56% of the people voted, compared to in the 19th century when we had 80% a couple of times voting. So, yeah, and this is a pause for a commercial. Get out and vote.
Well, Bill, two things, Sean. I have to give you. We had a viewer of our podcast write to us and say, "You keep saying 56%. You keep saying 56%. I read the number 58%. So it's not 56; it's 58. So thank you for writing into us. Thank you for saying 58. We'll live with somewhere between 56 and 58. Okay, let me go back to what you're saying about the primary. And I remember that happening. The same thing, again, I'm talking philosophically here, but it's based in reality. The same thing occurred the way that we report the voting on election day. If you recall, the major networks who cover the elections very often would predict the winner before the polls closed on the West Coast.
Particularly happened in the Carter election in 1980 when Reagan, and it was such a large majority that people were still voting in California when the CNN.
They called it, yeah. And they've changed that now. They've changed that. You cannot report that until all the polls closed on the West Coast where you are. The Constitution is a living document. That's what's brilliant about our Constitution. It's a living and breathing document that changes all the time. And just because we have something like an electoral college, which is over 200 years old, as I said, it doesn't mean we can't change it, refine it, or do away with it. I think we need to be responsive for what people are talking about and needing right now. And I think when someone loses the popular election and still wins the election on electoral votes, I think that's problematic. I leave it at that.
Yeah, I like I said, I could see either side. I think the one thing we do have to be careful of is polling. The polling showed that some of the polls showed that Hillary Clinton in the 2016 had a 90% or greater chance of winning, and we all know how that turned out. And we do have to be careful too. These are three populous states in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Those were three states that were won by Trump, and he got those electoral votes. He won by less than 70,000. Some say as few as 66,000 votes in those three states, and that's how he won the election. But what the other side of that coin, if you want to talk about the rule of the majority or tyranny of the majority. In California, he lost by 4 million votes. And are we going to say that California is going to decide our president each time? I mean, these are just arguments that, I say that we should have a voice, but if California is going to rule, where does that leave people who live in Wyoming or North Dakota or South Dakota or Rhode Island or any of the other states where there's so few people?
So in those ways, well, anytime California controls anything, we're in deep trouble, in my opinion. But that's a whole other story. I'm not going there. But the point here basically is the popular vote are the people that voted for it. That's what happened. The people went to the voting booth and pushed the lever and voted for whom they thought was the better candidate. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't see the intercession of electors going in there. I understand you're trying to protect the small guys, and I understand that. But the system is never perfect. All we're asking the system to do, in my opinion, is to be fluid as opposed to being perfect. I think that's what's really important here, and that's where I think the Electoral College debate comes from. Are we fluid enough to make changes, or are we fluid enough to do away with this if we don't need it anymore? And that's in debate. I mean, that's the debate that you and I are having right now. And if it was easy, we would have taken care of it, but it isn't.
Yeah, I still think, I'm on the fence. I was against it, but the more I thought about it in the past few days of doing this research, I do think that something is needed. And I think in the brilliance of the founding fathers, they were brilliant among all things except how they treated people.
Yeah.
So I do think that something is necessary to protect the tyranny of the majority. And in this case, 1 in 10 Americans live in California. 1 in 10 Americans live in California. So somehow we need to protect the other 9, that the 1 doesn't control everything that happens. The other things that I found it interesting, and this was from a video that was put together by a very conservative podcast, that it protects against the tyranny of the majority. We've talked about that the Electoral College encourages coalition building. I think that's possible, and it discourages voter fraud. Now, those last 2 things, you could say that there was no coalition building in the election of Donald Trump.
None.
And then he alleged voter fraud as late as last April. But there's been all sorts of, even the panel that he put together said, no, that's not the case. I
think the number that I saw somewhere, and I want to be, I don't want to say I'm exactly right here, but I remember reading it for the research, was there were 36 cases of voter fraud in over 1 billion votes counted for elections, not only presidential, but state and so forth and so on. So 36 to 1 billion is a minimal percentage. I don't even know what it is. I'm not going to try to do the math here. So voter fraud really is sort of non-existent. And coalition building, I wish it were true that we had some coalition building. I think everyone does, but we don't. Let's be honest about it. We don't. This country is more divided now than it's been in 100 years.
Now, we always talk about the vote not counting, my vote not counting, and I don't care about the president. So few people, 3 or 4 out of 10, didn't like either candidate in 2016. But what's important, especially in this Electoral College, the people who are the electors come from our congressional districts, the people who represent our congressional districts and our 2 U.S. senators in each state. Those congressional districts are drawn by people in the state legislatures, not in Congress. So it's important that we elect people that will handle this issue fairly. It's very difficult. Both parties gerrymander, but What's happened now is the gerrymandering has gotten so bad that it's very difficult for non-Republicans to get a voice, where you got districts that snake around the state. That's very bad, and that's why they say all politics is local. In this case, all politics is statewide,
Right.
not necessarily federal. But that is something that has a direct impact on the Electoral College.
No, that's absolutely right, Bill. You're 100% right. And it leads us into, I just want to touch us. I know our time is short. It always is every week, but because we get two old guys just wrapping around here, we can't quit it. Let's talk about voter restrictions, because there are a lot of those. And, you know, I mentioned at the top of the show, the Black Codes. The Black Codes were established right after the Civil War, and they were state laws restricting the new freedoms of African Americans. They couldn't, the right to assembly, working conditions, and some states, they even prohibited African Americans from voting. Okay, we've rectified that, hopefully, and we had in 1965 under President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Voting Rights Act, which by law outlawed all that stuff. But there is still tremendous restriction on voters. There are 33 states where a voting ID is mandatory. And we touched on that in our last podcast on voting, in the sense of, we all know who has a voter ID. If you're a person who drives a motor vehicle, if you're a person who's employed in a good job, you probably 99% have a voter ID. If you're an older person who no longer drives, if you're a person who's poor, who doesn't have any reason to have a picture ID, or if you're a person of color, you probably don't. Not you probably don't, but you very well may not. Let's leave it at that. So there is that still restriction on the books. And it started, you know, the first state to do it was Indiana. Interesting if you think about who your vice president is now, in 2006. And since then, I think as of in 2016, voter laws were now accepted in 33 states. So we're still trying to manipulate who can vote and who can't. And the reason being, most of the people who are being denied or made difficult to vote are people who usually vote Democratic, usually. And I think that's where we're really getting to a place of, we've got to overhaul this, and we've got to have, you know, the Voting Rights Act was good, and it was a good start. But again, as I said to you before, the Constitution has to be a living document. It's got to be able to be amended easier than it is now, and it's got to be able to deal with what's currently going on. North Dakota, just out of the clear blue, is the only state that I could find that you don't need to register to vote. You can walk into a polling place in North Dakota on the day of the election, show your driver's license, and cast a vote. Is that a good, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is voter registration needed, or is it just something that we put in place for whatever reasons? I don't know the answer, but I posed it to you.
In 2013, the Supreme Court decided that the 1965 Voter Rights Act had outlived its usefulness, and said there was, basically, in the lead opinion, the majority opinion by Chief Justice John Roberts, he famously said that, or implied that, racism was over. There was no more racism. The next day, efforts to suppress voting in Texas, in a couple of southern states, but basically in Texas, they said, okay, the court said that we don't need to let everybody vote anymore. And that was the real thing that the court decided, was that there were provisions in the Voting Rights Act that said states who made changes had to get those changes approved by Congress. And now the court said that that's unconstitutional, and the states can make some changes without getting Congress or Department of Justice approval. That I think that is completely out of line. Obviously, racism is not over, but you get a conservative court. The conservative court decides what it wants, and suddenly you have these issues from the 1960s reoccurring in 28 to 50 years later. These issues are back in front of us. It's completely sad to think that we have to go over this ground again, but here we are. And there are efforts to suppress you talk either through money, through fees. Some states are trying to go back to tests to find out if people can vote, qualify to vote. I think that's completely salacious and must be stopped. It's another reason why, throw another commercial in here, go vote.
Nobody has the right to tell you if you can vote or not. There are 4 things that you need to do to vote. Number 1, and I'm just taking this from the government website, so it's not me. You need to be a citizen of the United States of America. You need to be 18 years or older, meaning you can be 150 and still vote. You need to be a resident of the United States of America. You need to not be a felon. And as we said before, that's under discussion right now. I'm not sure that'll change, but
it's a big, excuse me, Peter, that's a big thing in the state of Florida this year. They could put another 1.5 million people onto the voting rolls if they change the rules and allow some felons to vote. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's what I was going to bring up to you, Bill. When you say, well, you're trying to bring up laws about reading and things like that, there's nowhere in what I just read, those 4 things, that says reading or writing. There are many instances, and we've all seen photographs of people being led to the voting booth and having the ballot read to them because they can't read. Okay? You're a citizen, you're 18 years old, you're a resident, and you're not a convicted felon. That's it right now as we stand right now. The thing that you brought up in Florida is actually happening in several states, but that's not passed yet. So as we sit here today in the middle of October of 2018, that's where we are. So, and you know, we have, you brought it up before, Bill, you touched on it, certain things in the Voting Act can be changed and altered and so forth. And that's what happens when we get a certain court. We get a liberal Supreme Court, we go one way. We get a conservative Supreme Court, we go the other way. I don't want to open a can of worms here, but of course I'm gonna. And that is, do we really want a Supreme Court justice for life? Or do we want to give a Supreme Court justice a term of, you name it, 10 years, 12 years, I don't know. But why does the Supreme Court justice have a life term? And I know there's reasons and so forth and so on. But again, in our fluidity, why?
We touched around, and eventually one day we've got to do a podcast on this, the Liberty Amendments, where people are saying that we need to have another constitutional convention. I think we're 6 states away from ordering that. The Constitution says if you get so many states, it must happen. We're 6 states away from constitutional convention. There's 13 amendments that generally come from the conservative side of the aisle. One of the key things is states' rights that would lead to the kinds of things that we're talking about, to have maybe voter suppression rules in place. And one of the things that made me think of it is a limit on the length of a Supreme Court justice. I think in the Liberty Amendments, I think it's 16 years. Yeah, there's a lot of effort that they're trying to do to change the rules to say that the mob rule of democracy is ugly. It's not a spectator sport. You got to get in there and participate. Another commercial, go vote.
There you have it, but that's no longer here. Everything is partisan politics now, everything. And that wasn't the case in those days. There was cross-pollination between the aisles. There were presidents like Lyndon Johnson, whose best thing was being able to work with everybody, bullying Democrats and Republicans equally. But at least it got things done. And now we don't have any of that any longer. I think the election is more than I'm going to vote A or B. I'm going to look at amendments. I'm going to look at what people are proposing. I'm going to look at where I want the country to be in 5 years or 4 years and how I want the country to proceed to that place. I think that's really important. I think a lot of people think, I'm just voting for this president. Well, you're voting for a whole philosophy, a whole way of doing things. And I think in 2016, you really saw that for the first time. I mean, you saw a lot of dirty politics and a lot of, gloves off infighting, and that's just whatever it is. But you had two people who were very, very different in that election.
Here in California, we have propositions. I think there's 12 on the current ballot, and they deal with things that the key things are limiting the amount of money that clinics can charge for dialysis. There's something about improving the roads. So all of these issues are there. We obviously we've talked a lot in this half hour about presidential elections, federal elections, but if you go vote. If you go vote, you can determine what's going to happen in your state, in your city, in your town, that will affect your life directly. You could say that the craziness that's going on in Washington now doesn't directly affect me, but if you are in need of medical care, in particular dialysis here in California, then you could vote yes on, I think it's Proposition 8, and have a limit placed on the charges, and the huge campaign to vote no. They're threatening people that are going to lose their ability to have dialysis, and all the proposition says is we're going to limit the cost. We want to put a cap so you can't charge anything you want for people who need dialysis care. So, yeah, I mean, your vote counts. That's the long and short. We said in the last half hour, your vote counts. It counts. And if you don't participate, if you don't use it, you're affecting my life, Peter's life, and the lives of everybody around you. So have your voice heard.
I just want to bring up one thing. I think we're going to try, I'm not sure we're going to succeed, but we're going to try to do a live show on Election Day. Yeah. We're in the midst of figuring it out, and I think if we're with a little bit of luck, we will, because I think this is really important. I can't stress enough how important it is to get out to the polls and vote. I saw, and I'm going to mess the name up, Taylor Swift, I think that's her name. She's a big rock and roll, I'm showing my age now. But I don't. They still call it rock and roll. I don't know. She's a music star. Let's put that as a superstar. She talked about voting, and 250,000 people registered to vote based upon what she said. So you know what? That's great. Good for her. And any way you vote, good for you. But get off your duff and get out there and vote. Any way that you believe in. Do a little research, read up a little bit. Most of us who are listening to this are older. We've been in the voting booths a long time. But a lot of us have kids and grandkids and so forth and so on. I do, Bill does. Get your kids out and get them to vote. Especially my young grandson who's 3. Get Reggie into the voting booth.
I don't want Reggie voting. That might skew the whole thing.
That'll skew the whole thing.
So until the next time, take care of each other and respect each other.
Peace.
You can get this podcast. You can tell someone else about this podcast. It's available through YouTube, through iTunes, and through Google Play. Let's hear from you. Let us know what you think so that we can be in community with you. And there is a way to contact us. That's at peter@AgnitusLife.com or bill@AgnitusLife.com. That's our email addresses. Let's hear from you. Let's open up the forum.